Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale, one that will keep you on the edge of your seat, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare yourself for a mystery shrouded in secrets, hidden powers, and a chase that could alter the course of history itself. Don't forget to subscribe, as you won't want to miss what comes next. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, the man who left no footprints. The London fog had rolled in once more, thick and oppressive, swallowing the gas lamp's dim glow and casting an eerie stillness over the street. The evening was quiet, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The heavy mist clung to every surface, dampening sound, distorting the shapes of buildings, and blurring the outline of the figures that hurried past. A sharp chill permeated the air, as if winter was determined to hold its ground against the creeping warmth of spring. It was a night suited for mystery, a night that invited the curious to step out of the shadows and into the unknown. At the corner of Baker Street, a carriage pulled up in front of the familiar townhouse, its wheels creaking in protest. The driver, hooded against the cold, barely glanced at the door before shuffling back to his seat. He had grown accustomed to the irregular comings and goings at 221B. It was not uncommon for the detective living there to emerge at odd hours, often drawn by some elusive case or an invitation that could not be ignored. Sherlock Holmes stepped out of the carriage, adjusting his coat against the evening's bite. The sharpness of his figure cut through the mist like a blade. His eyes, though hidden beneath the brim of his hat, missed nothing. They darted over the surroundings with a practiced air, as if each detail might hold a clue, even in the muted streets of London. His mind, always in motion, had already begun its work. The moment he stepped into the fog, his senses sharpened to the tiniest whisper of activity, the faintest scent of change in the air. He glanced at the door, noting the lack of any immediate activity within. It had been quiet in recent days, too quiet. The brief reprieve from the cases that often found their way into his life had been a welcome, albeit temporary, silence. He had used the time to study, to perfect his violin skills, to indulge in the occasional pipe of his favourite tobacco. But even in moments of stillness, Sherlock Holmes knew that his mind could never fully rest. And tonight, it stirred with an unfamiliar urgency. Dr. Watson, his faithful companion and chronicler, stood just inside the entryway, peering out at Holmes with a mix of concern and curiosity. The doctor's steady gaze lingered on his friend, measuring the detective's mood. Holmes was always precise in his appearance, methodical even in how he stepped into a room. But tonight, Watson noticed something else in his demeanour. An edge, a tension that seemed to hang in the air like the mist itself. "You've received a letter," Watson remarked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Holmes merely nodded, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. "Indeed, Watson, and with it, an invitation." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a crumpled envelope, its edges yellowed with age. The handwriting, though elegant, held a certain hurried quality, as if the sender had known the words would be read with urgency. Holmes broke the seal, unfolding the letter with deliberate care. "The Man Who Left No Footprints," Holmes muttered under his breath, reading the title aloud. His voice, normally precise and calm, carried a strange note of intrigue. "What is this?" Watson asked, stepping closer. The weight of curiosity rested on his shoulders, and the doctor could not hide the edge of concern in his voice. "A request for assistance, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes still scanning the page. "A mystery that promises to be as elusive as it is perplexing. A disappearance without a trace, no signs of struggle, no clue to follow. And yet, someone must know what happened." Holmes's words fell into silence, and Watson could feel the tension in the room rise, though it was not loud or overt. Holmes was not one to be drawn in by the mundane, but this case had already caught his attention in a way few did. The detective folded the letter and slipped it back into his coat pocket. He straightened, his gaze sharpening as if the very act of standing had drawn him into focus. "I will need to leave immediately," Holmes said, his voice carrying a quiet command. "And I have a feeling, Watson, that this case will demand every ounce of my skill and attention. Watson studied his friend for a moment, seeing the familiar glint in his eyes. It was a look he knew well, the calm before the storm of investigation. The detective was about to descend into the depths of a mystery, and Watson could not help but feel a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The hunt was on, and there was no telling where it would lead them. "You'll need a hand, I presume?" Watson asked, already moving toward the coat rack. Holmes's lips curled into a brief smile, the sort that spoke volumes more than his words ever could. "Indeed, Watson, and it would appear that you are the one best suited for the task." The night had grown colder as Holmes and Watson made their way through the fog-cloaked streets of London. The city had transformed into a place of whispers and shadows, and though the lights of the gas lamps cut through the haze in faint halos, the streets felt abandoned, as though the world itself had paused in wait. Holmes had led the way with a determined stride, his long coat brushing the ground behind him. Watson, though always a step or two behind, found his gaze drawn to the strange beauty of the fog, which seemed to devour every familiar landmark, transforming the city into something almost foreign. As they approached a narrow lane off Fleet Street, Holmes paused, and without turning to Watson, he spoke. "This is the place," Holmes said, his voice cool, but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. A warning, perhaps. "We are expected." Watson nodded, though the unease he felt was palpable. The building ahead of them was old, one of the many Victorian structures that lined the streets of London, but it had a peculiar air about it. There were no signs of life at the windows, and the door, though slightly ajar, appeared untouched by time, as though the entire building had been waiting in silence for them to arrive. Holmes, as always, seemed unbothered by the oppressive atmosphere. He took the first step toward the door with deliberate slowness, and Watson followed, only slightly hesitant. The entrance opened with a soft creak, and Holmes stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its once pristine crystals now coated with a thin layer of grime. The furniture, though expensive in its day, appeared to have been left in haste. The hall itself was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried the weight of secrets. At the far end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, revealing the soft glow of candlelight spilling out into the corridor. Holmes moved toward it with a quiet purpose, and Watson, following closely behind, couldn't shake the strange feeling of being watched. It was a sensation that grew stronger with every step they took, and though he couldn't explain why, Watson found himself reluctant to push forward. As they reached the door, Holmes gave a small nod and pushed it open. Inside was a large drawing room, furnished with rich velvet chairs and a massive fireplace that hadn't been lit in some time. Several people were gathered around a long table, their faces half hidden in the shadows, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. At the head of the table sat a man in his late 50s, with a gaunt face that suggested a life spent in the pursuit of knowledge, though his eyes held a hardness that belied any softness one might expect from such a scholarly air. His name, Holmes had been informed, was Reginald Moreau, a retired professor of anthropology with a reputation for dabbling in the arcane. His study of human nature, some said, had taken on a peculiar obsession with the darker aspects of psychology. Moreau's thin lips parted in a tight smile as he looked up at Holmes, his gaze sharp as if calculating the detective's worth. "Ah, Sherlock Holmes, I presume? I have heard much about you." "Moreau," Holmes replied, his tone clipped but polite. "You must be the one to request my assistance. I trust the situation is as dire as your letter suggested." Moreau's eyes flickered toward the others in the room. The other guests sat stiffly, their faces tense as they watched Holmes and Watson. There was a quiet murmur among them, the kind that hinted at something unsaid, something that could not yet be revealed. As Holmes took his seat across from Moreau, Watson's eyes drifted to the other faces in the room. There were 3 others, all appearing equally out of place in this odd gathering. The first was a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with striking features that seemed out of place in such a somber setting. Her dark eyes held a sharp intelligence, but her expression was guarded. She wore a deep red dress, though it was not the colour of her attire that caught Watson's attention. It was the way she carried herself. There was an air of confidence, but also something else, something darker. Her name was Eleanor Bishop, a former student of Moreau's who had taken to travelling in recent years. Holmes had noted in his preliminary research that she was particularly skilled in the art of negotiation. Next to her sat a young man, no more than 25, with a look of nervousness that made him seem almost out of place in a room filled with such composed individuals. His eyes darted around the room, avoiding direct contact with anyone. His name, Holmes recalled, was Andrew Hargrave, a solicitor from the city who had recently come into some fortune through an unexpected inheritance. He was still a relative unknown in many circles, which made his presence here all the more puzzling. The third figure in the room was a man of middle age, with a greying beard and a weathered face. His name was Charles Wills, a private investigator who had apparently been hired to look into the same case that had now brought Holmes to this strange gathering. Wills's face seemed worn with the weight of his profession, and there was something in his expression that suggested a quiet skepticism. Perhaps he had doubts about Holmes's ability to solve the case, or perhaps Holmes thought Wills simply found himself at odds with the situation they now found themselves in. Holmes took in their expressions with a quick glance, noting the subtle tension between the four of them. He sensed that they were not merely strangers brought together by circumstance, but rather individuals bound by a common history that none of them were willing to share just yet. "I assume you have all come for the same reason," Holmes said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned his attention back to Moreau. "To find the man who left no footprints." Moreau's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, but this is no ordinary case. And I must warn you, there are more forces at play here than any of us could have anticipated." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving Moreau's face. The room had grown quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old building settling. The tension that had hung in the air since their arrival now thickened, pressing in on all sides, as if the very walls were waiting for something to give. Watson, standing by the fireplace, felt a slight shiver crawl up his spine. There was something unnerving about the quiet, something that hinted at a much darker undercurrent. "I trust you will explain the situation in more detail?" Holmes asked, his voice cutting through the silence, though his tone was still as measured and calm as ever. Moreau's eyes flickered briefly to the others before returning to Holmes. His fingers twitched, an unconscious gesture of discomfort, before he nodded slowly. "Yes, of course. Please allow me to elaborate." As Moreau began to speak, the room seemed to draw in closer, their eyes fixed on him, each person listening intently, yet there was an undeniable air of reluctance. Even the ever-cautious Wills, usually so composed, shifted uneasily in his seat. "It began nearly a week ago," Moreau said, his voice steady but betraying a certain edge of urgency. "A man came to me, asking for help. His name was Elias Gray. He is a colleague of mine from the university. One of my protégés, in fact. A man with a promising future, a brilliant mind. But something was off. He was nervous, agitated. He said he had uncovered something he shouldn't have, something that could cost him his life." Holmes listened intently, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table as Moreau continued. "Gray told me that he had come across a document, an ancient text, one that he believed would reveal secrets that had been hidden for centuries. But he was afraid of what he had learned, of what it meant. He wanted my help, but before he could explain further, he vanished. Just disappeared. No sign of struggle, no indication of where he went." The words hit the room like a stone sinking into water, ripples of unease spreading outward, though no one spoke immediately. Watson could feel a prickle at the back of his neck as the gravity of the situation sank in. He glanced at Holmes, who remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. "I assume," Holmes began, his voice cool and methodical, "that this disappearance is the matter that brought you all here." Moreau nodded, his gaze flickering to the others once more. "Yes. But what's more unsettling is the manner in which he disappeared. There were no footprints, not a single trace of him left behind. His office was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. He simply vanished. And that, Mr. Holmes, is where I need your expertise. Gray was not the sort of man to disappear without reason." Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him as he considered Moreau's words. The mystery was growing more complex with each passing moment, but it was not the absence of evidence that intrigued him. It was the peculiarities of the story itself. "Did anyone else know of his discovery?" Holmes asked, his voice almost a whisper, though the question was laced with sharpness. "Could someone else have been aware of this document? Someone who might have had an interest in silencing him?" Moreau hesitated for a moment, his lips pressing together in thought. I cannot say for certain, but there were others in the university who may have known of his research. He was not working alone. He had colleagues, rivals even, who might have seen the value of such a discovery." The air in the room seemed to thicken as the gravity of Moreau's words set in. A man with a secret, a document of untold importance, and now no trace of him, nothing but an empty office and unanswered questions. Holmes rose to his feet, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the dim light filtering in from the window. He moved toward the fireplace, his mind already working at full speed, piecing together the fragments of information, searching for the thread that would pull the entire story into focus. "I will need to see his office," Holmes said, his voice decisive. "And I will need to speak with those who knew him best. If this mystery is as you say, it will take more than just observation to uncover the truth. There are forces at play here that none of us fully understand." As he turned to leave the room, the others followed suit, their movements filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Each person present had their own reasons for being here, their own motives wrapped up in the search for Gray, but Holmes knew that the answers would not be found in their stories alone. The door to the drawing room creaked open, revealing the narrow hallway beyond. The musty scent of old wood and dust filled the air as Holmes led the group toward the staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself were aware of the secrets it held. At the top of the stairs, Moreau paused, his hand on the banister as he glanced back at Holmes. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. There are things in this house, things in Gray's research, that should not be uncovered." Holmes turned his sharp gaze toward Moreau, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile. "It is precisely those things that I am most interested in." The group descended further into the depths of the house, toward the place where the mystery of Elias Gray would unfold. And with every step, Holmes could feel the weight of the case pressing closer, the answers teasing him just out of reach, but not for long. Not for long at all. The air in Gray's office was thick with the scent of stale paper and leather, a stale combination of knowledge and neglect. Holmes stepped inside, immediately surveying the room with his usual precision, his eyes darting from the cluttered desk to the shelves lined with books, some well-worn, others untouched for years. The room was dark, with only the faint glow of daylight struggling through the thick curtains. A single candle burned in the corner, its flame flickering slightly, as if resisting the oppressive atmosphere that had settled within the space. Holmes moved with an unsettling calm, his every step deliberate. Watson followed closely behind, his presence almost imperceptible in the wake of Holmes's commanding focus. The detective's hands, usually so steady, now moved quickly across the desk, skimming over the papers with an almost manic intensity. His eyes flicked between the scattered documents, scanning for anything that might suggest the path Gray had walked before his disappearance. "This is where it all began," Holmes murmured, his voice low and filled with something akin to reverence. He was studying the layout of the room as though it were a puzzle in need of a solution. "The room seems untouched, which is peculiar. You would expect more disarray, especially if Gray had been frantically trying to escape or had been disturbed in some way." Watson, unable to contain his curiosity, approached the desk, peering at the papers Holmes was examining. But where is the sign of struggle? The marks of a hasty departure? Surely someone would have left something behind, a clue. Holmes's brow furrowed slightly, but his gaze never left the papers. Exactly. That is the most perplexing aspect of this case. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, and yet no evidence of a peaceful departure either. Gray's sudden disappearance is the result of something far more calculated. But what? As he spoke, Holmes reached for a stack of papers near the edge of the desk and rifled through them. A brittle piece of parchment caught his attention, and he pulled it from the pile, carefully unfolding it. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. Watson moved closer, eager to see what had caught Holmes's attention. "What is it?" Watson asked, leaning over the desk, his voice hushed. Holmes held the paper out to him, still inspecting it with his sharp gaze. "This," he said quietly, "is a map. A map of the local area, but look closely." He pointed to a small, almost indistinguishable mark at the far edge of the map. A location, tucked away in the hills just outside of the city. "This is a place I've never seen marked on any map. It seems out of place." Watson squinted at the map, struggling to make sense of the faint markings. "What do you make of it?" Holmes's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was devoid of any warmth. "I think our next stop is clear." They were interrupted by a soft cough from behind them. Holmes and Watson both turned to see Moreau standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, as though the very act of stepping into the room had drained the colour from his cheeks. "I was wondering if you would find that," Moreau said, his voice faint, but edged with something like guilt. "That map. It was in Gray's possession. He must have been looking for something. But he was never able to explain it to me." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why did you not mention this earlier, Moreau? This seems to be a significant piece of the puzzle." Moreau swallowed visibly, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the doorframe. I did not believe it was relevant. I thought it was simply a piece of his research, unrelated to his disappearance. I never thought he would... Well, I never thought it would come to this." Holmes allowed the silence to stretch, his gaze fixed on Moreau with an almost predatory calm. "It is clear, Moreau, that you are not telling us everything. I would appreciate it if you did." Moreau hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously to the others in the room. Then finally he spoke. "Gray. Gray was obsessed with certain myths, legends, and ancient texts. He believed there was something hidden, something of great importance connected to this place. A treasure, perhaps. But what if it wasn't treasure that he was seeking?" Moreau's voice trailed off, as if even he did not fully believe the words he was speaking. Holmes stood still, his mind racing. This was no ordinary disappearance. The mention of ancient texts and hidden places, the strange map that had remained concealed for so long. These were all elements that spoke of something far more sinister than a simple vanishing act. "I believe," Holmes said slowly, his voice filled with quiet intensity, "that Gray was searching for something far more dangerous than treasure." The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words settling over them all. Holmes took one final look at the desk, his gaze lingering on the map, the papers, and then he turned to the others. "We must move quickly. If Gray found something dangerous, then I fear we may be too late." Watson glanced over at Moreau, who stood by the door, his face drawn with a mixture of fear and guilt. "But what could he have found, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the door, his steps purposeful, his expression unreadable. "We will find out soon enough, Watson. Let us hope we are not too late." As they left the office, the weight of the situation settled more heavily upon them. The mystery had deepened, and with each new clue, the question of what had happened to Elias Gray became more troubling. Holmes knew they were on the verge of uncovering something far more intricate than any of them could have anticipated, but what lay ahead, he could not yet say. The journey to the university had been brief, yet fraught with a quiet tension that neither Watson nor Holmes could ignore. The city outside was slipping further into its nocturnal stillness, the gas lamps flickering like distant stars as they moved through the fog toward their destination. The carriage wheels clattered faintly on the cobblestones, a sound that seemed almost too loud in the suffocating quiet of the night. As they arrived at the university, the imposing facade of the building loomed before them, its spires reaching into the fog like fingers tracing an unseen sky. Holmes, ever the observer, studied the structure with the same intensity he had given to the case. It was, after all, another clue, a silent witness to whatever had transpired within its walls. They were ushered into a small, dimly lit office by the university's dean, an elderly man with a sharp, bony face that gave little away. His eyes, however, were restless, betraying the anxiety he could not quite hide. Holmes wasted no time in cutting to the heart of the matter. "Dean, I trust you understand the urgency of our investigation. We are here to ask questions, direct ones. I expect you to be forthcoming with what you know about Elias Gray's recent behavior." The dean hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his glasses. I've already told the police everything I know, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice tight with the kind of restraint that suggested a man on the edge of breaking. Gray was a brilliant young man, always inquisitive, always passionate about his work, but I didn't see this coming. I didn't know he was involved in anything dangerous. Holmes's gaze never wavered, his eyes sharp, cutting through the dean's facade. "What exactly do you mean by that? Dangerous?" The dean's gaze flickered momentarily to the doorway, as though considering whether he should speak the truth or withhold it. His voice, when he finally spoke, was strained, almost a whisper. He became obsessed. He was working on something, some kind of theory about an ancient text, a piece of history that no one had seen in years. He became reclusive, started isolating himself. There were strange reports about him talking in his sleep, muttering about things he couldn't possibly know. Watson, standing by the window, furrowed his brow. "What kind of things?" The dean swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know. Things like, the old city beneath the hill, or they are coming for us." It didn't make sense. Elias was always an intelligent boy, but he was never like this before. Holmes gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the dean's face. "Did anyone else notice these behaviors? Anyone close to him?" The dean glanced toward the door again, his face pale under the stress. "His colleagues, his friends. Some of them even tried to confront him, but Elias was stubborn. He didn't want to share anything with them. He insisted that this discovery, whatever it was too important to discuss. He said it would change everything." Holmes's gaze flicked to Watson, then back to the dean. "And you didn't think to alert anyone? The potential danger?" The dean's lips pressed into a thin line. "By the time I realized how far he had gone down this path, it was too late. He had already disappeared." A heavy silence followed his words, the weight of it hanging in the air like an insistent pressure. Watson could feel the unease growing within him, the unsettling realization that the truth was likely far darker than either of them had imagined. Holmes, however, remained unmoved by the dean's confession, his mind already working over the possibilities, sifting through the bits of information they had gathered. "Tell me about Elias's colleagues. Who else was involved in his research?" Holmes asked, his voice flat and incisive. The dean shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There were a few others. 2 were students and 1—" He stopped, his throat constricting as if the name was too painful to speak. "One was a fellow professor, a man named Edmund Clark. They were close, those 2, almost inseparable. Clark is, well, let's just say he's more than a little eccentric. He was always pushing Elias further, encouraging him to dive deeper into these forbidden subjects. Holmes stood up abruptly, his expression unreadable. "Take us to him." The Dean seemed taken aback, his hands wringing nervously. I don't know if that's a good idea. Clark's not the type to take kindly to inquiries. He's difficult." "Then we will simply have to make him understand," Holmes replied, his voice devoid of warmth. "Show us the way, Dean." As they moved through the corridors of the university, the air seemed to grow heavier, the walls pressing in around them as though the building itself was reluctant to reveal its secrets. They reached the professor's office, and the Dean knocked hesitantly on the door. From within, a gruff voice called out, "Enter." The door creaked open, revealing a cluttered room filled with dusty books, scattered papers, and strange artifacts that made the place feel more like a forgotten museum than a place of scholarly study. At the desk sat a man who could only be described as unsettling, Edmund Clark, his wiry frame hunched over a stack of open books, his eyes wild behind thick spectacles. "Professor Clark," the Dean began, his voice unsteady. "These men wish to speak with you. It's about Elias Gray." Clark's eyes snapped up, his expression hardening instantly. "Gray? Elias? What is this nonsense? That boy has vanished, and now you bring these strangers into my life." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze fixed firmly on Clark. "We are investigating his disappearance. We believe you may know more than you're letting on." Clark's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humour in it. "I know nothing more than anyone else," he said, his voice tinged with contempt. "Elias was a fool, playing with forces he could not understand. If you want to solve his disappearance, you might want to look elsewhere." Watson felt an unsettling chill pass through him. Clark's words, though laced with disdain, seemed to carry a deeper meaning, one that neither Holmes nor Watson could yet fully grasp. But Holmes's response was swift, and his words were deliberate. "I think, Professor Clark, you know exactly what happened, and I think you're afraid of what we will find." The confrontation with Professor Edmund Clark left a palpable tension in the air as Holmes and Watson departed the university's cluttered halls. Holmes, always a man of unshaken resolve, did not falter as they stepped into the carriage, the dim light of London's streets flickering past them, casting long shadows across the cobbled road. Watson, however, could feel a gnawing unease creeping into his thoughts, a feeling that had not subsided since their interaction with Clark. The professor had been evasive, curt, too eager to distance himself from Gray's disappearance, and yet there had been something in his eyes, something telling that Watson could not easily dismiss. Holmes was silent as the carriage moved, his face set in an unreadable expression. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the cobblestones and the occasional crackle of the distant flames of the gas lamps. Watson finally broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "Do you believe him, Holmes? Do you think Clark was truly uninvolved?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, his fingers, almost absent-mindedly, drummed against the window frame as though the sound had become the only thing to anchor his thoughts. His sharp gaze was turned outward, scanning the dark streets as if he might find the missing pieces of the puzzle hidden there. "No," Holmes finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Professor Clark is hiding something. His reaction was too quick, his denial too forceful. The way he distanced himself from Elias, it felt like a carefully rehearsed defense, not a natural response. There's more to him than he lets on." Watson nodded, his mind racing through the details. There was a contradiction in Clark's words that nagged at him, a hint of deception buried beneath the professor's composed exterior. But what could he be hiding? What possible motive could he have for keeping Elias's research, or his disappearance, a secret? Holmes's lips curled into a tight smile, one that was more a flicker of amusement than genuine mirth. "That, Watson, is the question we must answer, and I suspect that the answer will not be as simple as it seems." As the carriage rattled on, they arrived at their next destination, A small, dimly lit pub tucked away in a side street, its windows fogged with the steam of a dozen conversations. The atmosphere inside was thick with smoke and the clinking of glasses, the chatter of locals weaving through the thick air. Holmes, unbothered by the noisy clamour, made his way to a corner table where a man was already waiting. This man was a former colleague of Elias Gray's, a scholar of obscure texts, but someone who had grown distant in recent months due to disagreements over their research. His name was Richard Hollis, a lean man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet intensity. As Holmes and Watson approached, Hollis looked up from the table, his expression guarded but intrigued. "You've come," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I wasn't sure if you would. I didn't think Elias's disappearance would draw this much attention." Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries. "I'm not here to discuss his disappearance, Mr. Hollis. I'm here to ask you about the research he was involved in. His recent work on ancient texts. What do you know about it?" Hollis shifted in his chair, his fingers twitching as if tempted to reach for his drink, but then pulling away. "Elias was a fool," he muttered bitterly. "He dove too deep into the unknown. That last discovery. It was madness. I warned him, you know. I told him to stop, to leave it alone, but he wouldn't listen." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What exactly did he find? And why were you so adamant that he stop?" Hollis hesitated, his gaze flickering around the room, though no one seemed to be paying him any mind. He lowered his voice even further. "Elias, he believed he had uncovered a map to something ancient, a city buried beneath the hills, a civilization lost to time. But he didn't just stop at the map. He started studying more. Texts, symbols, old legends, things he shouldn't have touched." Watson, intrigued despite himself, leaned closer. "What do you mean, things he shouldn't have touched?" Hollis's eyes flickered with an unease that was hard to ignore. "There are things in this world that are better left undiscovered. Secrets that man was not meant to unearth. Elias thought he was on the brink of something incredible, but I fear he woke something he couldn't control." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on Hollis, his expression stoic, but inside, his mind was working furiously. The pieces were starting to come together, an ancient map, an obsession with hidden cities, and a warning from someone who had known better than to dig too deep. But there was something more to Hollis's words, something that hinted at a much darker reality. "You're afraid, Mr. Hollis," Holmes said, his voice almost a whisper. "Afraid of what Elias uncovered. But I suspect there's more you're not telling me." Hollis stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "You think I'm hiding something? What is it you think I know, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes didn't flinch. "I think you know exactly what Elias found, and I think you're afraid to speak of it. But I also think you're not the only one who's hiding something. Everyone involved in Elias's research is hiding something. Moreau, Clark, you all have motives, don't you? Motives that go beyond the pursuit of knowledge." Hollis shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his glass. His gaze darted to the door, to the shadows that seemed to linger just beyond the pub's dim light. "You're right," he muttered, his voice low. "We all have motives. But some motives go beyond personal gain. You should leave this alone, Mr. Holmes, before it's too late." Holmes studied him for a long moment, his eyes piercing, unyielding. "I never leave anything alone, Mr. Hollis, especially not when the truth is so close." The night had descended further into its quiet, brooding depths as Holmes and Watson made their way back to their lodgings on Baker Street. The fog, now thick enough to obscure all but the faintest outlines of the city, pressed in on all sides, shrouding their path as though the very air conspired to conceal the truth. Holmes's mind, however, was far from clouded. He moved with the precision of a man who had already pieced together a portion of the puzzle, yet the final piece, elusive as it was, remained just beyond reach. Watson, for his part, was quiet, his thoughts swirling with all they had learned from their interviews with Moreau, Clark, and Hollis. The professor's cryptic warnings about forbidden knowledge, the hushed words of those who had worked with Elias Gray, all of it swirled together in a fog of uncertainty, and Watson could not help but feel that they were on the verge of uncovering something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Holmes, walking with his usual brisk pace, stopped abruptly just before they reached the door to their flat. He turned to Watson, his expression unreadable, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Watson, do you believe in coincidences?" Holmes asked, his voice low and calculating. Watson raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. "Of course not. Not when it comes to matters like this." Holmes gave a single sharp nod, as though Watson had just confirmed a theory he had been mulling over for some time. "Exactly. Everything we have learned, from Moreau's vague admission to Clark's cryptic statements, points to one undeniable conclusion. Elias Gray did not simply stumble upon his discovery by accident." Watson's brow furrowed as he followed Holmes into the room, closing the door behind them. But what is it he found? What exactly was he looking for? Holmes wasted no time in answering, his fingers moving quickly as he paced across the room, the silence in the air broken only by the soft click of his shoes against the wooden floor. Elias Gray was not simply studying an ancient civilization or some forgotten city. He was uncovering something far more elusive, something that many believe should remain hidden. I suspect that Gray's research led him to an artifact, a key perhaps to unlocking something much darker than treasure or lost knowledge. Watson's heart quickened, a sense of unease settling in his chest. "You mean some kind of powerful object? Something that could pose a threat?" Holmes nodded, his gaze now fixed on the desk, where papers and maps were scattered in disarray. "Exactly. It is no coincidence that Elias Gray's disappearance coincided with his increasing obsession with ancient texts. Texts that he believed held the key to a long-lost civilization, one that may have possessed knowledge that could alter the course of history." Watson could feel the weight of Holmes's words, the sharp edge of impending danger cutting through the room like a razor. He stepped forward, his eyes searching the papers for something he had missed, some clue that could confirm Holmes's theory. But why did no one notice sooner? Why the secrecy? Holmes paused, his gaze flickering briefly to the maps pinned on the wall. "Because the discovery was not meant to be found. There are forces at work here. Forces that would stop at nothing to ensure that such knowledge remains buried." For a moment, the room seemed to close in around them, the oppressive weight of Holmes's words hanging heavily in the air. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire as it burned in the hearth, its light flickering in the stillness of the room. Holmes, ever the master of deduction, finally spoke again, his voice steady, but filled with the quiet intensity that Watson had come to recognize as a sign of breakthrough. "I believe the artifact Elias found is not merely an object of historical value. It is something far more significant, something that can be used, perhaps even manipulated. And I believe that someone, perhaps someone we have yet to meet, has taken great interest in ensuring that the secrets Elias uncovered never come to light." The detective turned toward Watson, his expression hardening as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "We are no longer just investigating a disappearance. We are now pursuing something far more dangerous. Someone, or something, is willing to go to any lengths to keep these secrets hidden. And I intend to find out who, before it's too late." Watson swallowed, a mixture of awe and trepidation settling in his chest. He had followed Holmes through countless mysteries, but this was different. They were dealing with something far beyond the ordinary, something that defied reason and logic, yet was terrifyingly real. And for the first time, Watson felt the sharp sting of fear. Fear that they were not just chasing a missing person, but a dark force that would stop at nothing to remain in the shadows. Holmes turned away, walking toward the window and looking out into the night. His expression softened, but only for a moment. "Tomorrow, Watson, we must delve deeper into the past. The answers lie there, waiting to be uncovered, and I will not rest until they are." Watson stood silently, taking in the weight of Holmes's words. He had seen his friend solve many cases, but this felt different. There were dangers ahead, dangers they could not yet comprehend. And as he stood in that room, staring out into the fog-covered streets of London, Watson knew one thing for certain. The game was changing, and the stakes had never been higher. The sun had barely risen, casting a weak, pale light through the curtains of their Baker Street flat, as Holmes and Watson prepared for the next step in their investigation. The night had been spent reviewing every document they had gathered, retracing their steps, examining every small detail once more. But now, with the first light of morning filtering in, the urgency of the situation had never felt more immediate. Holmes stood near the fireplace, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him as he stared into the smouldering embers. The calm, controlled expression on his face betrayed none of the tumultuous thoughts racing through his mind. Watson, sitting at the desk nearby, watched him quietly, knowing that something significant was brewing. The pieces were falling into place, and Holmes was on the verge of a breakthrough. The quiet, contemplative demeanor Holmes displayed was often a signal of impending action, swift, decisive, and relentless. "It's time, Watson," Holmes said, his voice sharp and filled with purpose. "We cannot afford to wait any longer. The artifact Elias discovered is not just a relic of the past, it's a weapon, one that can bring unimaginable power to whoever controls it." Watson rose from his seat, a sense of unease washing over him as he stood beside Holmes. "But who would want such power, Holmes? Why go to all these lengths to keep it hidden?" Holmes turned toward him, his eyes glinting with a mix of intensity and cold logic. "Someone who understands its true nature, someone who knows that it cannot fall into the wrong hands." He paused, his gaze narrowing as he continued. "I believe we've been chasing shadows, Watson. The people we've spoken to, the clues they've given us, they all point to one singular conclusion. But it's not a person behind this. It's an organization, a secret society with deep roots in this city. And I suspect they are the ones who have taken Elias Gray." Watson felt a chill run down his spine as he processed Holmes's words. The idea that a powerful, hidden group was involved made everything so much more dangerous. It wasn't just a case of a missing man. It was a battle for control over something far more sinister. "You think Elias was taken because he found something they didn't want him to find?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice resolute. "And they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep the truth from being uncovered." The detective turned away from the window and strode toward the door, his steps purposeful and quick. "We must confront them, Watson. It is time to uncover their secret." The streets of London were different now, quieter, more oppressive, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The fog had thickened once again, wrapping the buildings in a blanket of grey, muffling every sound. As Holmes and Watson moved through the streets, the path ahead seemed uncertain, but there was no turning back. Holmes led the way with a confidence that belied the dangers they faced. Each step took them closer to the unknown, to the heart of the mystery that had entangled them both. They arrived at a large, imposing building nestled between two smaller structures. It was an old mansion, its facade worn and weathered by time, but there was a sense of foreboding about it that made Watson's skin prickle. This was it, the place they had been seeking, the location marked on the map Elias had found. Holmes didn't hesitate as he approached the door, his knock firm and commanding. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit entryway. A figure stood in the shadows, its features barely visible in the low light. The door opened just wide enough to allow them entry, and Holmes stepped inside without a word. Watson followed, his heart pounding in his chest as the air grew thicker with every step. The house was silent, save for the sound of their footsteps echoing off the cold stone floors. Holmes moved with the precision of a man who had already mapped out the interior in his mind. Every corner, every shadow seemed to be measured, calculated. He didn't pause until they reached a large room at the center of the house, where a gathering of individuals stood before them. At the center of the group stood a tall, imposing figure, A man whose face was partially obscured by a mask, his voice deep and controlled as he spoke. "You are persistent, Holmes. I had hoped you would leave this alone." Holmes did not flinch. His eyes were fixed on the man, unwavering. "I never leave things alone," he replied coldly. "I've pieced together your lies, your deceit. I know what you are after, and I know you have Elias Gray." The masked man tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Holmes and Watson. Elias Gray was a means to an end, a tool for uncovering something far greater. But now that you've come this far, I suppose it is time to reveal the truth. He motioned toward a figure standing off to the side, who moved forward with a grim expression. It was Elias Gray, though he looked vastly different. His eyes were dull, his skin pale, as though he had not seen the light of day in weeks. His movements were slow and deliberate, and his expression was one of resigned defeat. "Elias!" Watson exclaimed, his voice filled with surprise and concern. "What have they done to you?" Gray's lips parted slightly, but his voice was weak. I couldn't stop them. They knew too much. I found it, Watson. I found what they were looking for. And now they've taken control." Holmes stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the masked man. "You're hiding behind shadows, but you will not escape the truth. The artifact Elias discovered, it's not just a piece of history. It's a key to unimaginable power, power that you think you can control." The masked man's laugh echoed through the room, cold and empty. "You think you understand, Holmes? You don't. This is bigger than you can imagine." Holmes's eyes never wavered. "Then explain it to me," he said. "Tell me what you're truly after. What is it you intend to do with the power you seek?" The masked man paused, and for a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something akin to hesitation. Then, with a cold finality in his tone, he spoke. "We intend to reshape the world, to bring about a new order, and Elias Gray was merely the first step." The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence thickening around them. Holmes's face darkened, his mind already racing with the implications of what had just been said. The game was no longer just about finding a missing man. It was about preventing something far more catastrophic. The masked man took a step forward, his voice low but deadly. "You've come too far, Holmes, but it's over now. You will not stop us." Holmes's eyes flashed, his mind already turning the situation to his advantage. "We'll see about that." The silence that followed the masked man's words seemed to stretch endlessly. The dim light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the room, the crackling fire the only sound breaking the heavy atmosphere. Holmes stood motionless, his eyes locked on the masked man, his mind racing through 1,000 calculations. Watson, standing just behind him, felt a tightening in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Elias Gray, still standing with a haunted look in his eyes, had barely moved since his appearance in the room. Holmes's voice broke the stillness. "You believe you can control this power, don't you? That you can reshape the world according to your will?" His words were cold, but underneath them lay an unmistakable conviction. "You are wrong. This artifact, whatever it may be, cannot be controlled. It was never meant to be." The masked man's lips twitched into a smile, though there was little amusement in it. "You are a fool, Holmes. The artifact was never meant for you to understand. It is beyond your comprehension." Holmes's expression hardened. "Perhaps, but that does not make it any less dangerous." The man in the mask stepped forward, his body language shifting, as though the mask itself were no longer necessary. He reached up and removed it, revealing a face Watson had never expected to see. Professor Reginald Moreau, the very man who had brought them into this labyrinth of lies and secrets. His features were drawn, the years seeming to weigh heavier on him now than they ever had before. His eyes, once sharp with intellect, now gleamed with a feverish intensity, as though the knowledge he sought had consumed him entirely. "Moreau," Holmes said, his voice sharp. "So it was you all along." Moreau's smile widened, a glimmer of madness in his eyes. "Of course, Holmes. Who else? The others were mere pawns, tools in a game I have been playing for years. You think Clark and Hollis were the masterminds? No, they were merely misguided. They didn't understand the full extent of what I was after." Watson felt a chill run down his spine. But why? Why go to such lengths? Why manipulate everyone, including us? Moreau's expression twisted into something darker, a gleam of arrogance mixing with something else. Fear, perhaps. Because the artifact could change everything. The power it holds is unlike anything this world has ever seen. I sought it to secure my place in history, to gain control over the forces that shape our world. But those fools, those students, they couldn't see it. They only saw the surface, the knowledge, the ancient civilization. They never understood the deeper truth. They never understood the cost. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes fixed firmly on Moreau. "And now you would use it to bring about a new world order, one built on deception and power." Moreau's smile faltered for a moment, but only briefly. "You don't understand, Holmes. You never did. There are those in this world who are meant to lead. Those who have the vision, the intellect to change things. I only wanted to bring about a new age, one in which we no longer bow to the whims of fate." Elias Gray, who had been standing motionless for most of the conversation, suddenly spoke. His voice was barely more than a rasp. I couldn't stop them. They were going to use the artifact to control everything. I thought I could destroy it, hide it away, but I was wrong." His eyes met Holmes's for the first time, filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. "I couldn't stop them." Holmes's gaze softened as he turned toward Elias. "You did what you could, Elias. It was never your fault. You were drawn into something much larger than yourself." Moreau let out a bitter laugh, his eyes narrowing. "It's too late for that now. You think you can stop me? You've already seen too much. The artifact is already in my hands. There's nothing you can do." Holmes's eyes gleamed with cold determination. "You are mistaken, Moreau. There is always something that can be done." He reached into his coat pocket, producing a small object, an intricate key, its surface carved with ancient symbols. He held it up for Moreau to see, his voice steady. "This key will prevent the artifact from being used. It will lock away the power you seek, the power you have no right to control." Moreau's face twisted in disbelief. "Where did you—" "I knew you were hiding it, Moreau," Holmes interrupted. "You believed you could manipulate everyone, but I was always a step ahead. I just needed the right key to stop you. And now, with this, your plans are finished." Moreau's gaze flickered from the key to Holmes, his face contorting with rage. "No, you can't—" Before he could finish, the room seemed to pulse with a sudden sharp crack of energy. The artifact, which had lain hidden beneath a cloth on a nearby pedestal, began to glow with an unnatural light. Moreau's face froze in shock, his body rigid with fear. Holmes acted quickly, stepping forward and placing the key into a hidden lock in the pedestal. The artifact's glow dimmed immediately, the room falling silent once again. Moreau staggered back, his expression one of disbelief and defeat. "You think you've won?" Moreau's voice was barely a whisper, his words heavy with a finality that spoke of resignation. "You think you've stopped what's coming? It's too late. The power, it's already out there. You can't undo what's been done." Holmes met Moreau's gaze, his face a mask of cold resolve. "We can't undo the past, Moreau, but we can ensure that it doesn't repeat itself." The tension in the room was palpable, as though the very air held its breath. Holmes turned to Watson, a silent understanding passing between them. The game was over, but the cost of their victory was still uncertain. As they turned to leave the room, the finality of their actions settled in. The artifact, locked away for good, had been secured. Moreau would be dealt with, his plans thwarted. But the weight of what had transpired, of the power they had just narrowly contained, hung heavy on Holmes's mind. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, the first light of day breaking through the haze. The streets of London, though still shrouded in mist, seemed less oppressive now. The city was waking up, unaware of the danger it had just narrowly avoided. Holmes and Watson walked down the cobbled street, their footsteps echoing in the quiet morning. "What now?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with exhaustion. Holmes looked out over the city, his gaze distant. "Now, Watson, we wait. There will always be more to uncover, more shadows to chase. But for today, we have won." And with that, the two of them walked away from the remnants of a case that had nearly unraveled the very fabric of their world. The mystery was over, for now.